Good afternoon and welcome to this month's installment of Professional Development brought to you by the TEC University. As a common courtesy, I ask you to please hold all questions till the end of the presentation and please mute your microphone and video feed as we deal with some Wi-Fi internet connectivity issues. For this today, we're going to be focusing on feedback. A quick little funny story about this seagull here. I think we all probably have sat on the beach somewhere or a lake and watched how seagulls just kind of swoop in, take advantage of the area around them, make a lot of racket, and then they just fly off. Well, a lot of times we see that in the Air Force with feedback when we get it from our supervisors or peers. I have a personal experience. I had a co-worker, we called them Sergeant Slam Bang actually, and Tornado. He would come to a job site, give us feedback on how we were doing, mess our whole plan up, and then he would just leave us to our own devices for the rest of the day. We really didn't have a clear picture of what was really expected after that individual left the job site. So really feedback needs to be better than that. So today we're going to focus on how to understand how to give effective feedback. We're going to be looking at the definition, the purpose of it, some sources you can drive it from, the types of feedback to give individuals, those different levels, effective feedback, and then some guidelines on effective feedback as well. So what is feedback? When you're asking yourself what feedback is information provided regarding aspects of one's performance. So we always want to focus on specific information provided to an individual on that actual performance itself. So what does that do for us as supervisors? Well, it fills the gap between what is understood by our airman or the individual that we're working with and what is aimed to be understood. So when we're looking at a specific task, we need to break down whether they understand the task, what they actually understand about the task, and what our end goal is for that individual to understand about that said task. So how do we improve one's performance? Well, there's a least effective way to do that, and then there are more effective ways to do that. At the bottom of our scale here, the least effective way to deliver that performance and improve that performance is through punishment. I think a lot of times, all too often, it's just way too easy to punish individuals when they're not performing to our expectations or performing to the standard for that task. Well, what we really want to focus on is moving up in that scale. We do that by offering rewards. A lot of times individuals have that intrinsic motivation or the extrinsic motivation and are really motivated by those rewards. So that is a more effective way to give feedback to an individual. Thirdly, another great way to improve performance is through praise. A lot of times individuals have that intrinsic motivation and are really pushed to do better in their jobs or specific tasks through that praise. But how we really want to improve an individual's performance on a specific task is through feedback on that task and how to do it more effectively. Going back to that seagull in that specific example I had about myself, we never received specific feedback on the job that we were doing, and we were never told how to do it more effectively. So when that individual left the job site, we were left with more questions on how to perform our task than we were on how to actually do that. So we want to make sure we take time to focus on the task and give feedback directly on how to do that task more effectively. So why do we give feedback? If you look at this feedback loop here, we like to look at it is we look at the performance, the specific task or a process, give that individual specific feedback on that task, so then they're actually able to adjust on their current performance. Through this feedback loop, it's a continuous process. So every time we look at an individual and a task that they are performing, we look at their performance, we give them specific feedback on that task or that process, and then we give them ways to adjust their performance to perform better. Now, what we don't want to do is just give them feedback once and then leave them to their own devices. There's a balance here. So when we're looking at performance, we want that individual's performance to always be going up and increasing. So if we look at it in a skill level, let's say we have a brand new airman, they're a 3 level, and we're trying to get them to that 5 level and then to that 7 level skill level. Well, we need to look at what they're performing at the basis for their 3 skill level. So we look at their performance, we give them specific feedback on that, and we help them adjust their performance to obtain that 3 level. And then we just don't let it go. We want to look then at their 5 level. Okay, how are they performing in their 5 level upgrade? We give them specific feedback for that task and we help them adjust. And we keep doing that, so on and so forth. And this doesn't need to be specifically for upgrade training. This could be certification on a specific task in your shop, in your unit, whatever they are working on at the time, we want their performance to grow. So it's a stepping stone throughout their career as well. So when we're looking at the purpose of feedback, there are 2 different ways you can do that. That's informational feedback and motivational feedback. So let's take some time to look at that informational feedback and what that is. The informational feedback is what the knowledge and skills that individual has. So that is what you're going to focus on. When you're giving feedback and that purpose for informational, look at the knowledge and skills that that individual has and give them specific feedback on those knowledge and skills only. Secondly, we have that motivational. We also need to look at that individual's attitude and desire to perform that job or that task. So maybe that individual has the information, maybe they have the knowledge and skills and you know they know how to do their job, maybe they're just not motivated enough and they don't have the right attitude or the desire to perform well. So instead of just telling them, hey, they need to do the task and skill better, maybe you need to take a step back and look at if that individual is motivated, if they have that desire to do the job, and maybe you need to give them specific feedback on their attitude and their desire. Maybe motivation is what they need to go out there and perform their job more effectively. I have a coworker, he was in this situation, he was a young staff sergeant, he was a weapons loader, and his team, they had the knowledge and skills to perform the job, to load the aircraft and get them launched in time. What they figured out, kind of back in those E4 Mafia days, they're going to be at work for 12 hours regardless. So they're given 4 work orders, 4 jets to load, and they're like, well, we could take 3 hours each jet and we'll have something to do all day. So they had the knowledge and skills to do that. The problem was they didn't have the motivation to do their job quicker. They're like, hey, we're just going to be here all day, so we might as well take all day to do this. So their superintendent actually figured out how to motivate them, and then their work performance actually went up because it was a motivational thing, not a knowledge and skills thing. So where do we derive our feedback from? Well, there's 4 different areas we can derive our feedback. The first is your supervisor. Your supervisor should be your first source of feedback. They should be the individual that is the subject matter expert within your shop, especially if you're that airman in that upgrade training. You as the supervisor need to have that subject matter expertise to give those individuals the feedback on how to perform well inside their job, in their shop, throughout the workday. The second place we derive our feedback from is our peers. Peer-to-peer feedback is great. The one thing we really like about peer-to-peer feedback is 9 times out of 10, when I'm receiving peer feedback, I'm a little bit more receptive to that because it's from my peers. It's individuals that I'm working alongside of. It's those individuals that I have those personal relationships with. So for me personally, I'm a little bit more receptive to that peer feedback, and generally most people are as well. One thing we really like to do is have that source of feedback from yourself as well. A lot of times, me as an individual personally, I like to look at like how I'm performing my job. I like to look at like my EPB or even quarterly awards packages and say, okay, how am I performing this quarter? How did I do for this half of the year? How am I performing ranked into my duties as an instructor here at TEC? So self-feedback, self-reflection is great for that as well. And lastly, you can do that through evaluations. Now, every year we're supposed to do an EPB on our airmen, and we're supposed to have EPBs, those enlisted performance briefs, done on us every year. That is a great tool to use in evaluation and a source of feedback. The one thing with that is if you're only receiving that feedback from that EPB once a year, there's a whole year worth of time where you really weren't getting any feedback. So you can do informal evaluations. Let's say you have somebody that is recently upgraded, maybe you notice they're not performing their job really well, do a little informal evaluation on them and then give them specific feedback on that task that they are performing for that day. So what are those different types of feedback? Well, we like to look at them like this. First, we have goals. We like to say feed up, give them feedback on specific goals. What we like to say is, where am I going? So we take an individual, and you can do this on yourself as well, and think about where you're going. So have an individual, your supervisor or mentor, that knows your goals, and they can help and give you feedback on those specific goals to help you get there. Okay? Next, we want to look at that current performance. This is great for the day-to-day work center. This is where that feedback really comes into play. So we look at that current performance. How am I performing now? I think it's great when an airman or a peer comes to you and asks you, hey, how do you think I'm doing right now in my job? I just started this job. How do you think I'm doing? What can I do better? We're looking at that current performance. So this is more like your day-to-day job. And then we like to look at that future performance. Again, if we go back a couple slides, we're always trying to get that performance of our individuals up. So how can we help them get to what is next in the future? We can say things like, hey, if you keep performing this way, I can see that you're going to meet your goals and your current performance is going up, and your future performance, if you keep on this path, you're going to do great things. So we look at the goals, the current performance, and then we always want to look at that future performance as well. So what are those different levels of feedback? Well, specifically, we like to start out with task. So this is when we determine how well a task is understood or performed. A task is something very specific. For me in the CE world, I like to look at this of like changing out a lock on a specific door. I can take an airman out to the job, say, hey, I need you to change this lock on this door, and I'm going to give them specific feedback on the task of changing that door out. Say, hey, I like what you did there. You might have made a little bit too much tension in the lock. It's going to end up jamming up, and then we're going to have to come back out on this work order. So that's a specific task. So do this when you do this task. So specific things on something very specific, a specific task. Okay? Secondly, we look at the process. How well an overall process is understood or performed. So going back to my lock demonstration, okay, I just had them do the task of changing a lock out on a door. Well, now I'm going to give them feedback on, okay, so we get a work order, we go out, we make contact with the customer, you did well meeting with the customer, you changed the lock, and then you followed up with the customer as well. Maybe what you need to do is, on the next time you work with this customer, give them a little bit more details on when the job will be fixed or how we fix the job so they feel better. Lastly is going to be that personal level of feedback. How motivated and committed that individual was to that job or that process. So again, we want to make sure we're looking at the task, the process, and the person as well. So being in CE, it's a lot of customer service based, so hey, maybe you need to be a little bit more personable when you're talking to the customer. You came off kind of harsh or demeaning to them. Again, we're a customer service based, so we need to work on that as well. So those are the different levels of feedback. So when we put the types and levels of feedback together, you can put all this together. So when you're looking at specific goals, maybe the level that individual feedback needs to be for that person, maybe they understand what they need to do to meet their goals. Maybe they understand the process. Maybe they have lost that motivation. If they have lost that motivation, then that's when you would get onto the personal level of feedback to help them get there. And that same thing goes for the current performance. Maybe on the personal level, they're super motivated, they want to be there for their job, they're super motivated, but maybe they just don't understand how to physically do a specific task. Well, you'll need to give them that task level of feedback and not really worry about that personal level of feedback if they are super motivated. So really, when you're giving that feedback, it's learning how to handle each situation and use specific reasons and specific types of feedback for that issue. So when we're looking at feedback, some things we want to consider is the first one needs to be objective. The biggest thing with objective feedback is when we start giving that individual that feedback, we need to leave our personal biases towards that individual at the door and focus specifically on the task, process, or maybe their motivation. I think a lot of times we all kind of get in this where, hey, maybe we have an airman that just doesn't perform really well, and we have these biases towards that individual and we let that affect our feedback session with them. Let's not do that as good supervisors. Next, we want it to be acceptable. So for acceptable feedback, we need to realize that each individual is going to take feedback different than maybe I would take feedback from an individual. So we want to make sure we approach each person on that personal level and make sure we give it to them in a way that's acceptable to them. This really goes down to knowing your airmen and then having really those honest conversations with them and know how to approach that person. Constructive, it needs to be constructive to the point where we're always looking at the performance of that task or that process. So make sure you're giving specific examples for feedback that are constructive to help them perform better. And flexible feedback, hey, we need to make sure that, again, not every person is cut from the same cloth. Maybe they don't accept praise very well, or maybe they are somebody that's motivated by rewards. So we need to make sure we are tailoring our feedback to that individual. The biggest thing we want to consider is that we follow a specific process and have our feedback organized for that individual. The better you have your feedback session organized, the better it's going to flow, and then 9 times out of 10, that individual is going to receive that feedback more effectively. When we're looking at something that is extremely difficult or has a lot of steps, and we're looking at a specific task or process, a comprehensive feedback that tailors it to each one of those steps and covers all areas is more acceptable than just focusing on one area. So comprehensive feedback that covers everything is good as well. So what are some do's and don'ts with feedback? So what you want to do is build and maintain rapport with those individuals. Again, I like to just have honest conversations with those individuals, getting to know my individuals, getting to know my airmen before I have to go in there and give them feedback. That way I can understand them, I can be flexible and adaptable with my feedback approach to them. So build and maintain that rapport with them is a great thing to do. Something you want to do also is give both positive and negative feedback. I think a lot of times we kind of get into that rut where we just focus on negative feedback too much because we want them to do better. But hey, maybe they did something positive that day. Maybe they're not a very motivated individual and they actually came to work super motivated that day. Give them some positive feedback on that. Again, it's all about looking at their performance, giving them feedback, and you want them to adjust their performance. And again, you want to be selective with your feedback. We don't always need to be harping on these individuals like, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're not doing this right. Be selective. It takes time for people to grow in their jobs as airmen and NCOs. So let's be selective. We don't need to be harping on them all the time, and so on and so forth. So one thing we don't want to do is focus on that always and never. For me personally, when somebody says, hey, you never do this, or even my wife is like, hey, you never take the trash out, I'm like, well, yeah, I did. I just took it out yesterday. 9 times out of 10, when somebody says that you never do this or you always do this, it's not generally the case, and people generally get defensive when that happens. So avoid those statements of always and never. It really just kind of starts that feedback session off in a negative light. If an individual just can't really fix something, let's not criticize that. If they're aware of it, it's just not time to criticize it. If they're trying their best, if they really can't fix on how they do that specific task, let's not criticize that. Let's find a more effective way to give that feedback. Here's one thing that happens a lot, and for me personally, is don't get defensive. A lot of times in those feedback sessions, the person you're giving feedback to might get a little upset, especially if it's that negative feedback. You as a supervisor, just take that with a grain of salt. Don't get defensive, just realize that everybody has emotions and kind of let that roll off your back for the day and then come revisit that later. So don't get defensive. It doesn't need to turn into a yelling match when you're giving that feedback. Again, it's about looking at the performance, giving them that feedback, and adjusting that performance as well. So here are some helpful hints when performing feedback. So when we're talking about an immediate task, that is when immediate feedback is the best. If somebody's performing a specific task, like my airman that is changing the lock in a building, I'm going to give them feedback right then and there if they're doing something wrong, because if they do it wrong and we leave, we're going to end up having to come back. So specific task is immediate feedback. When you're looking at a process, let's say my airmen, I have them go out and I have them look at a job, meet with the customer, install the lock, meet with the customer again to tell them the job is done. I'm going to probably wait until the end of the day to say, hey, let's look at your job performance as a whole today. We had 5 jobs that we did. I noticed on job number 1, you were really good with the customer. Job number 2, you were a little bit more short with the customer, and so on and so forth. So when you're looking at the overall process, that delayed feedback is best to use at that point. When we're giving that person that negative feedback, it's more effective at the personal level. I had a instance in my career where we get picked on in front of the entire flight, some negative things that happened. Well, nobody was really acceptive of that feedback at that time because it was put on public display. Take that individual aside, give them that negative feedback, and then give them some tips and tricks on how to be better. Positive feedback is best when committed to you want them to be better, okay? So we want our individuals, our airmen, our NCOs to perform better in their careers or at their jobs. So give that positive feedback when you want them to be better at their jobs. And then lastly, negative feedback, we don't want it to be like, well, you have to do this. Well, they don't really have to do that, so we need to figure out a way to talk to them and be like, hey, you did this, this was not acceptable, here's what I want you to do to be better. Try this when you're talking to the customer, it'll go over better. So those are some helpful hints when it comes to feedback. So today what we looked at was the definition of feedback, the purpose of feedback, some of those sources you can drive that feedback from, the types, levels, effective feedback, and then some of those guidelines and helpful hints on giving that effective feedback. So basically at the end of the day, when you're giving feedback to your individuals, you don't want to be that seagull that just swoops in, makes a bunch of noise, rains on everybody's parade, and then just dips out and leaves them with no effective feedback or positive feedback to do better. That concludes today's briefing. I will open it up for a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat.
TEC University. Education your way.